Peter, creating art takes a lot of training and technique. All the great artists I knew took classes.
Even Walt Disney?
Do I have to?
You want to be a star, don't you? Then take it off! Yeah, that's nice.
It started an empire, it started a brand, it started a dream. It was the one that started it all. Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Hard to believe that it first came out 80 years ago on December 21st, 1937, a time so long gone that it actually came out closer in time to the American Civil War than present day. While it actually wasn't the first feature-length animated film, it was the first cel animated feature film and the first period in the US, and the impact that it made is still being felt today. So, how did what was once considered Disney's folly make way for nearly a century of growth for both Disney and animation period? Well, that's what I'm here for, so get ready to watch me awkwardly attempt to sound informative and intellectual, because this is a retrospective on Snow White.
From humble beginnings.
Prior to the development of Snow White, Disney was already trying to push the medium of animation even further. Within the time span of a decade, the company went from producing silent cartoons with synchronized sound, and eventually color. They would even begin to break away from the rubber hose style that was very popular in the 20s and try to do a more realistic and story-driven animation. During this time, Walt began to wonder, how can I make more money? As he realized making cartoon shorts wouldn't be economically sustainable in the long run, and he could be doing bigger things. So, in 1934, Walt Disney and his team of animators got to work on their first full-length animated feature. While this may seem like a natural next step in the evolution of animation, many didn't feel the same way. Walt had to fight to get his vision made, and even his own brother and wife didn't believe him, but Walt, never one to quit, persisted. He even went as far as to mortgage his own house just to fund it. We even have audio of another method Disney used to pay for it that has never been released before until now. So, what method did Walt use? Well, listen and find out.
Come on, guys. It's my dream. I already gave up on my other dream. Come on. I'll suck your dick if you let me.
I'm sorry. Years of hard work went into making it all come together. Being based on the relatively short German novel by the Brothers Grimm, they had a lot of room to change and add things to the story. From the personalities of the Seven Dwarfs to the ending of the film, they diverged quite a bit, which I would personally give credit to the writers and storyboard artists for being as creative as they were. Makes you wonder if people were also crying bloody murder for not sticking close enough to the source material back in the day. But it was the Great Depression, so they were probably too busy trying to find food to eat or try not to die in hot air balloon accidents or whatever people did during that time. As the time of release came closer, many in the film industry began to call the film
Disney's folly.
as production costs skyrocketed way past initial expectations. Its detractors at the time thought no one wanted to sit down for an hour and a half to watch cartoons which at the time barely had plots to fill out their 7-minute runtime. If this movie had failed, could you imagine the ramifications that this would have had on animation? Like, if critics hated it or if no one wanted to see it, Disney would have been done. I don't just mean Walt, but the whole company too. Toy Story, The Lion King, Pirates of the Caribbean, Frozen, none of that would have existed. Subsequently, rival animation studios like DreamWorks or Illumination might not have existed either, as the demand for animated films wouldn't have been there that became established with Snow White. Actually, a world without Illumination probably would have been for the greater good, so eh. But of course, that didn't happen. The film opened on December 21st, 1937 to immensely favorable reception from everyone attending. Soon after this, buzz for the film spread from magazines to audiences across the country, and wordless, it would become the highest grossing film of all time up to that point. It was the Star Wars of its time, a huge hit that revolutionized the way films were made. Which might sound crazy to some of you now, but think about it. No other film up to that point looked even remotely like it, and on a technical level was doing things no one else was doing. It was definitely an event to witness on screen. But despite all of this praise, it did not get a single Oscar nomination for Best Picture, which even now baffles me as to how the Academy could intentionally overlook this one-of-a-kind movie that at the time most critics adored. Like, not even a nomination for Best Song or Art Direction either. Like, come on, like,
What the fuck?
I mean, of course, not winning an Oscar isn't the end of the world at the end of the day. So many films have never won or been nominated for Best Picture that are still beloved and iconic to this day. Like, what movie came out in 1937 is still being remembered by the general public, and how many of them are still being studied by film scholars and historians? Not many, obviously, and it sure as hell isn't the life of Emily Zola. Snow White would eventually get an honorary Oscar a year later though, so there's that. But it wasn't all smooth sailing after this. Multiple times afterwards, the company would face financial troubles as Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi would all flop soon afterwards, as they couldn't make back their budgets upon initial release, which, combined with the advent of World War II, would cause Disney to start packaging glorified shorts as films. They would eventually rebound with Cinderella, and then flop again with Sleeping Beauty, and then soon afterwards go through a creative rut in the 70s and all this other stuff. Point is, they weren't always as business savvy as they are now, but they weren't afraid to take risks, which is pretty commendable. It seems like most movie studios would rather play it safe than take a risk, which is why it's always nice to see something new or different come out that breaks the mold. But in the long run, all those risks would pay off, as Disney is now one of the largest companies and businesses in the world, and most, if not all, of their films are remembered fondly by the general public. And it's all thanks to Snow White for lighting that match.
I'm so ashamed of the fuss I've made.
So, now that I went over a Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged version of Snow White's development and release, what do I think of it? What is my completely professional and non-biased opinion on it? Well, even after 80 years of Disney movies, I still think it holds up remarkably well. Like, it may not be Disney's most technically impressive film, that honor could go to Pinocchio, Fantasia, or Bambi. It still looks damn good, especially for a first-time effort. They really got a lot right. The characters are all very memorable, and each of the dwarves, while being pretty much defined by their names, are still very charming and stand out from one another. And everyone has a favorite too. Mine would be Dopey, for example. Snow White, many would argue, lacks flaws and is just generally uninteresting, but I kinda would have to disagree. Yeah, she is friendly and in the universe is considered super beautiful and whatnot, but she's also naive and gets frightened very easily. Hell, she pretty much dies just because she was too trusting of others, but her innocence, to me, is part of what makes her so captivating, since unlike most other Disney princesses, she's very childlike. You even feel bad for her when she collapses into the forest because of how terrified she is and doesn't know what to do. At least compared to Aurora from Sleeping Beauty, she doesn't spend the majority of the running time asleep or off screen. The prince, by contrast, doesn't really get much to do. He was originally supposed to have a whole scene where he got captured by the evil queen and then eventually escapes the cell, which would have explained why he just disappears from the story until the end, but they cut it to streamline the story. The concept for that scene did seem to get reused for Sleeping Beauty though, so the prince in that movie actually does get something to do. And of course, the evil queen is a highlight of the movie, as she is still very creepy with her cackling laughter as the witch and her deep and glaring eyes. She doesn't honestly have a very good reason for hating Snow White, but her pettiness is what makes her just so nasty and evil. She also gave us this iconic line.
Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?
So yeah, screw you, Hans.
Kiss my ass!
But back to the animation, it still holds up for the most part. Some of it is a little jittery and reminds you that yeah, this was made in the 30s, and when you look at the deer and other animals compared to Bambi, it looks very basic and primitive even, but thankfully scenes like that are few and far in between. You can tell the animators put their all into this, as this movie would either make or break their futures. Their characters are all full of life as they stretch and squash and have dimension and weight with every action they perform. Their facial expressions are also very expressive and have personality, and contrary to popular belief, not all of the scenes with realistic humans is rotoscoped, which speaks a lot to how well the animators managed to convey realistic movement. But in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with rotoscoping, as it adds an edge of realism that isn't always there in animation. I'm also very impressed by the water effects in the film, which we really see Disney take to the next level in Pinocchio, but even here, it still wows me at how real they look.
For the one I love.
And the soft watercolor backgrounds make the film look like an old children's book come to life. The use of watercolors also gives the film a different look from other animated films, since most don't use watercolors for the backgrounds, except for a select few like Lilo and Stitch. The woods feel deep and endless thanks to the use of the relatively new multiplane camera and the use of German expressionism for certain scenes and backgrounds that gave the film a darker and unnerving vibe that many seem to forget about.
Thirsty? I will drink.
It's not all sunshine and singing birds throughout. I mean, would a G-rated Disney movie these days have a scene of a grown man almost stabbing a 14-year-old girl, more specifically to cut her heart out and put it in a box? Or how about how the dwarves resort to starting a mob to kill and beat the witch to death with their own fists and clubs? I should also note that shortly before the release of Snow White, Disney released a short called The Old Mill. What's significant about this is that all the animation techniques that were used in Snow White were used here. As I mentioned before, Disney was experimenting with different animation techniques leading up to the release. It also happens to be Hayao Anime was a mistake, Miyazaki's favorite Disney film.
極めて何か
生命に対する侮辱を感じます。
Not short, but film period, which you can make what you will about that, because I've already been going on for far longer than this has any right to, and I'm tired. Lastly, I like to bring up the music.
Someday my prince will come. Someday we'll meet again. And away to his castle we'll go.
You know, the songs, I know the songs, pretty much everyone has at least heard one of the songs from the movie. The writers and composers did a fantastic job creating not only memorable and hummable song numbers, but the score as well, which can be whimsical and curious but dark and exhilarating. It definitely earned its Oscar nomination, that's for sure. Also worth acknowledging is that this was the first film soundtrack to be issued for commercial sale, so that's another first that Snow White did for the film industry. I also miss the huge choirs they used to use for Disney films back then. They gave the film and others like it such a grand scale that made every scene feel so important and bigger than life. While time has passed, I think it's still safe to say that this is definitely one film that time won't be forgetting. And Disney might buy time itself too, so that will guarantee we won't forget about it. Its influence is still being felt, as even though we seem to be trying to get away from the whole fairy tale thing in movies these days, the tropes they're trying to subvert date back to this film. It's one of my favorite films ever, even now as an adult, and I hope that future generations of kids can also appreciate this film like I did when I was younger. The animation industry owes a great debt to the hard work and effort that went into creating Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.